Chair. Can I just thank everybody for attending this very important debate. I want to begin by first paying tribute to the humanitarian aid workers in Gaza who continue their life-saving efforts to face impossible odds, despite having every reason to lose hope. They remain steadfast in their mission to provide aid and are the only source of survival and hope for the people of Gaza. Sadly, at least 289 of these brave individuals have been killed. And I trust members here will join me in honouring each and every one of them. Chair, the horrors facing the people of Gaza are overwhelming, reflecting Israel's efforts to strip away their humanity. Since the attack on 7th of October, the collective punishment inflicted on Gaza has been shocking. 90% of the population has been displaced, being moved from pillar to post. 96% face acute food insecurity, now with over 42,000 deaths in the past year. Though this number doesn't include the thousands of bodies still buried under the rubble of destroyed buildings, loved ones who will never be recovered. This debate is not about the Israelis' military onslaught of the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. It's about those being killed, not by weapons, but by lack of basic humanitarian assistance. Israel has weaponized the denial of aid, pushing the remaining Palestinians to the brink of death. The health crisis in Gaza is devastating. Since October the 7th, at least 10 children per day have limbs amputated, many without anesthesia. Over 500,000 of the population suffers from disease like jaundice, caused by malnutrition and the unsanitary conditions they're forced to live in. That's the size of almost half of Birmingham's population. Hospitals, the very places that could help, are in ruins. 31 of Gaza's 36 hospitals and most UN healthcare stations have been damaged or completely destroyed by Israeli airstrikes and ground operations. The Lancet estimates the real death toll could be closer to 186,000, and with flood season approaching, the situation is set to get even worse. This isn't a case of shortage of aid, as we all know. We've all seen thousands of trucks lined up on the border. It's a deliberate act. Israeli authorities are intentionally limiting the supply of vital aid. They've destroyed civilian infrastructure, schools, water stations, mosques, churches, and claim military necessity. But the humanitarian workers on the ground tell a very different story. These are not military targets, yet the bombs keep falling and critical aid facilities are being obliterated. Before October 7, Gaza was receiving 500 aid trucks a day, just enough to keep the population afloat. Now the numbers stand at a mere 52, according to Oxfam aid workers.
On that point,
yes, I'll give way to the number.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Throughout the past 12 months, the UK government has failed to highlight or prevent the Israeli government's denial of international assistance into Gaza and its clear breaches of international humanitarian law. The UK has also failed to highlight the Israeli government not complying with International Court of Justice orders, which require it to facilitate the unimpeded access to Gaza of United Nations and other officials engaged in the provision of humanitarian aid. The UK is failing to stand up for international law as Israeli forces are forcibly transferring civilians as we speak from... Does my honourable friend agree with me that the UK must urgently act to enforce UK Security Council resolutions?
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. Of course, I think we all sing off the same hymn sheet when it comes to what the UK should be doing. Experts, Chair, say 2,000 trucks are required to address the current crisis. 2,000, where we only have 52 coming in at the moment. Aid convoys are being blocked, not only at the checkpoints by Israeli soldiers. We've all witnessed some of the Israeli civilians blocking aid at crossings, like Kerem Shalom and Nitzana. And whilst the Israeli army are competent to disperse thousands of protesters in Tel Aviv within minutes, they choose not to disperse the less than 100 protesters blocking life-saving aid. And even once they get through that blockade, they are shot at by IDF forces, either by snipers, drones, or other military means. We all know about the killings of the 7 aid workers from the World Central Kitchen charity, which included 3 British aid workers. This was despite the Israeli army being given coordinates and information about locations.
Would he give way?
I'll give
The honourable gentleman for giving way. He mentioned aid workers. Would he not agree with me when it's not just aid workers, but media workers, teachers, doctors and medical staff, when we see a discrediting of the UN, a delegitimisation, and he mentioned buildings, even the oldest church in Christendom, it does feel like even within the rules of war, something's gone wrong here.
I thank the honourable member's contribution and intervention. Of course, and the biggest problem we have is that journalists are not allowed in. And one has to think about the reason why journalists are not being afforded the opportunity to report impartially, and it's not happening. If the Israeli government had nothing to hide, you would expect them to be welcoming journalists into a war zone. The risks are down to the journalists. But we've seen this on an enormous scale. Journalists believe that they are being targeted specifically, so there's no reporting from within. Chair, this is collective punishment on an enormous scale. There are no red lines for Netanyahu's government. The actions of the IDF over the past 369 days are not those of a moral army, as Israel claims, but one that has crossed every moral and legal boundary. Netanyahu's pursuit of Gaza's destruction is relentless and will not stop unless forced to do. I welcome the reinstatement of the UNRWA funding by this government, but we must do more than just
give way.
I will give way.
I agree. I thank the honourable member for giving way. And I agree the calls for additional aid and safe routes for the delivery of aid into Gaza are vital and encouraged. However, would the member agree that questions must be raised as to the absurdity of a situation in which we as a country provide both the aid and the weapons to bomb the besieged people of Gaza?
I agree with my honourable member, and I'm sure there'll be much more in terms of contributions throughout this debate. But I welcome the reinstatement of the UNRWA funding by this government. But we must do more. We must address the root cause of the suffering. An immediate, permanent ceasefire is absolutely essential. Diplomatic calls from all governments of various nations have fallen to deaf ears. The only option available now is to enforce a ceasefire by the prohibition of all arms sales to Israel. If the UK did this, it would send a clear message to others that would inevitably follow suit. But as innocent lives are being lost, this government has done little to change the course of Israelis' aggression. I ask the rhetorical question, how can we send aid on the one hand whilst providing the weapons of destruction with the other? How can we claim to stand for morality and justice when we are complicit in this collective punishment? Of course, the time is of essence, Chair. Every 10 minutes, another child in Gaza dies. This regime of mass murder and destruction is fueled by the West's unconditional support and granting full impunity for the breaches of international and humanitarian laws. The change for time is now, not later. So I ask, Chair, will the Minister admit that Israel is actively blocking efforts to distribute humanitarian aid and reach a ceasefire agreement? And what will the government do to encourage Israel's opening of border crossings for humanitarian aid? Thank you, Chair.
There are a number of members who wish to speak, and I'm going to impose an informal 3-minute time limit, so please be kind to each other so that you can all get in. The question is that this House has considered humanitarian aid and Gaza. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Ms. Bass, and thank you to my friend the member for Perry Barr for getting this debate today. It is absolutely crucial and essential. Last night, my friend the member for Blackburn and my friend the member for Perry Barr attended a film showing by Al Jazeera to a cinema nearby here. And that film was of raw, very raw footage of the behaviour of Israeli soldiers in Gaza, about destruction of life, and about the appalling death toll of children, particularly across Gaza. And it showed soldiers cheering when they'd managed to destroy an entire Palestinian village. It showed pictures that were devastatingly realistic in the horror they showed of the torture against Palestinian prisoners being held in Israeli prisons. And after that, we had a question and answer session with a number of people, lawyers, medical people, and so on. And the doctor who was there described how when she tried to enter Gaza to act as a doctor, she was restricted to one suitcase. She was told she had to bring in 3 days' water supply. She was told she had to have her own personal security. She was told she had to have a car and a driver with her at all times in order just to undertake her work as a doctor. And she said there are very few hospitals working in Gaza. The conditions are appalling and abominable. And many doctors are now not working in Gaza anymore because they simply cannot get in, because Israel controls all access and exit to Gaza. And so the small number of very brave and wonderful doctors that were working there are now being forced to go elsewhere. And so what this film showed was the way in which Israel's occupation has been directed entirely towards the destruction of Palestinian life, Palestinian buildings, schools, roads, hospitals, and everything else. I've never forgotten going to Beach Primary School in Jalabia refugee camp many years ago. Wonderful school, wonderful place, wonderful children. And with joy, these children sat down and read, through translation, the poetry they'd written about their lives, their hopes, and what they wanted to achieve. And then we went onto the roof of the school, and you could see the fence on one side, and not that far away you could see the sea. And to the north you could see Ashkelon. And you could feel the sadness in their voices as they said, we're never going to be able to go anywhere. We're never going to be able to travel anywhere. We are forever prisoners in this school and our homes. But at least at that time, they had homes and a school. I've seen the footage and seen the films. The school is totally destroyed. Many of those children that I met who were so happy in those days are now deceased. Famine is there in Gaza. It is registered as a famine around the world. Polluted water, inadequate food, inadequate medical supplies, absolutely appalling situation. And so we have to, yes, demand all the aid that we can to go into Gaza. Obviously, we would do that for any people anywhere in the world. But when there are over 40,000 recorded deaths and possibly 100,000 more bodies waiting to be discovered under the rubble, the answer has to be a political one. Why are we still supplying arms to Israel, knowing full well that those arms, in contravention of ICJ rulings, are actually being used to bomb civilian targets in Gaza? War crimes are being committed before our very eyes on our televisions every night. It's up to our government, to show that if it believes in international law, it would halt the supply of weapons to Israel because it knows full well those weapons are being used to destroy human life in breach of all aspects of international humanitarian law.
Yeah. Thank you. I just want to say that I expect to take wind-ups from the front bench at about 4:05. Florence Eshaloni.
Thank you, Ms Vaz, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship this afternoon. And I also want to pay a tribute to the member from for Birmingham Perry Bar for securing this really important and timely debate. A year on from the tragic terrorist attack by Hamas, with an estimated 101 people still being held hostage, we are seeing the devastating impact on innocent civilians caught up in this war. As we've heard, it's estimated that over 41,000 Palestinians have been killed, over 90,000 injured, and up to 1.9 million people have been internally displaced. Thousands of families are trapped, unable to leave their homes to find vital food and water, and many are now facing starvation. Chair, shortly after this conflict started, I met with Islamic Relief UK, who were based in my Vauxhall and Camberwell Green constituency. They spoke to me about the devastation and the impact on the ground in Gaza, including the bombing of their offices, and the fact that they lost contact with their aid workers for 2 days. And over the past year, Islamic Relief UK have distributed over £26 million of aid to the people in Palestine. I want to pay tribute to Islamic Relief UK and the many other aid organisations and the charities working on the ground, with their aid workers risking their own lives to help innocent civilians. Along with many others, I welcome the Foreign Secretary announcing in his first statement to the House that the UK will lift the pause on funding to UNRWA and an additional £21 million to support this work. But sadly, we know that that money is going to be too late for many people who've already died. I had the opportunity to meet with a senior representative from UNRWA last week, and he outlined 3 main challenges to me. One being logistical. The vital aid continues to be blocked. There are estimated 70 trucks going in, compared to the 400 pre this conflict. Moving aid around Gaza is near on impossible, with an estimated 30% of that aid being looted because people are just so desperate. Aid workers are being attacked. The second was political. We all have to acknowledge the concerted attempt to discredit and undermine the work of UNRWA. And as the Foreign Secretary stated, UNRWA is absolutely central to those efforts, and no other agency can get aid into Gaza in the scale needed. However, there are 3 bills currently in the Cabinet aimed at UNRWA in terms of discrediting its operation in East Jerusalem, stripping its status as an aid agency, and declaring it as a terrorist organisation. The third one was financial. There are still serious difficulties, and the largest donor has still not reinstated their fund in the US. So I asked the Minister if he's aware of the letter today co-signed by 15 leading aid agencies, including Islamic Relief UK, Medical Aid for Palestine, Oxfam, calling on the UK to continue to take a stand on upholding international law, to oppose the annexation in northern Gaza, and to support the independence of the ICJ and reviewing the sale of arms. As we enter the 2nd year of this conflict, we reinstate our calls for immediate ceasefire and lasting peace in the region.
Under your chairmanship, I congratulate the honourable member for securing the debate. Earlier this week, 6 Arab ambassadors came to speak to members in this House, and they include not only Palestine and Lebanon, the 2 main protagonists here, but Egypt, Saudi, Jordan and Bahrain. And they said that they spoke on behalf of the whole Arab community. And the message they wanted to get across to members was that long-term peace and security is attainable in the region. It has been for nearly 20 years now under the Arab Peace Initiative, and that looking forward, that is still the prospect of one that they want, and that includes all, not just Arab states, but 58 Muslim states around the world, not just recognising but cooperating fully with Israel. And yet what we have seen over the last year is the opposite of that, the ratcheting up of violence. Now that has happened on both sides. And nobody here holds a brief for Hamas or Hezbollah. But because of the asymmetric nature of this war, almost all the deaths post the terrible atrocity of the 7th of October last year have been among Palestinians, predominantly 41,000 in Gaza and almost 1,000 in the West Bank, and now over 2,000 Lebanese civilians as well. So the question for today, Ms. Vaz, is what is the British government's response going to be to this? And yes, the government consistently calls for ceasefire, and the Minister, who does his job excellently, has been very consistent in saying this. But there is no response. On the contrary, the atrocities get worse. What is happening? We saw today another school attacked, nearly 30 people killed there, attacks on UN positions by Israeli forces. Yes, the government is right to emphasise aid, which is the subject of this debate, and the practicalities of getting aid in. But there are also these attacks going on a daily basis on civilians. There is forcible transfer of the population. There are breaches of international law happening all the time. There is collective punishment of the Palestinians, particularly in Gaza. There is famine and there is disease throughout the territory. And so I say to Minister gently that we do need more from the government now. We need to know what the government is going to do to ensure that a ceasefire happens. What are the practical steps it can take with allies? And we also need, and this was emphasised very much by the ambassadors this week, we also need an early and clear recognition of a Palestinian state. Mm-hmm. Until that exists, it is almost impossible to frame the terms of a ceasefire and a lasting peace in the region. And that is what we need.
John MacDonald.
To raise again the issue about the evacuation of children from Gaza. Children have been seriously injured. Months after the war started, no, let me go back one. When the Ukraine war started, we very rapidly put in place a mechanism for the evacuation of injured children from Ukraine to hospitals here to ensure that they had the appropriate treatment. And it was a system that worked and seemed to have worked effectively. Soon after the attack on Gaza, my friend Kate Holland, who was the member for Blackburn, raised in this House the issue about trying to instigate a similar scheme for Palestinian children. I raised it, I think she did that around November, December time. We heard nothing back. So I raised on the floor of the House with the then Deputy Foreign Secretary the issue again, and we were given an assurance. I'd met with the voluntary organisation Save Gazan Children based in France, and there was also Save a Child were doing the work to evacuate children from Italy at that point in time, and other countries surrounding Palestine itself as well. I raised it again in May because we had no response. Then the general election happened, so I wrote to the Prime Minister because I felt this needed a Prime Ministerial push to get this through. I raised it with the Foreign Secretary because we needed to ensure our diplomatic efforts were involved. And I raised it with the Home Secretary. I wrote to the Home Secretary as well because we need the visa arrangements put in place. I never received a response. So I wrote again in August to my honourable friend from Oxford East, who was the Minister of State for International Development. And I did receive a response, but it was not about the evacuation. It was about the assistance that's being provided to organisations working, hopefully, as best they could within Gaza. So I wrote again, and I haven't received a second response. I'm not sure what's happening in government on this. I understand a new government has come in. It's difficult settling down, sorting out arrangements in place. But this is a matter of urgency. We've had further reports this morning of another hospital being attacked. And we've also heard reports of the doctors being threatened if they didn't evacuate, they would be arrested. And we've even had ambulance workers arrested this morning as well. And they're leaving children, they're having to either evacuate children from intensive care, which is risky, or they've been forced to leave them behind. And some doctors, as a result of that, are risking their lives. What we could do is exactly as we've done with Ukraine, just simply establish a system to ensure that the most seriously injured children are evacuated. Clinicians are willing to assist here. In fact, I've had clinicians contact me and say, what can we do? How can we assist? I just asked the Minister to take this back and come back as a matter of urgency now, because children are dying as a result, and we can't stand to one side.
Mary Kelly-Foy.
The Honourable Member for Birmingham Perry Bar for securing this afternoon's debate. And in the short time that I have, I want to focus on the plight of Christians in Palestine. In April this year, I was honoured to meet Father Gabriel Romanelli, the parish priest at the Holy Family Church in Gaza, who informed a group of MPs of the tragedies that had befallen his flock. None more so, perhaps, than the killing of Nahida Anton and her daughter Samar, 2 parishioners at the church who were killed inside the compound of the parish by a sniper, and several others were wounded. It was the week before Christmas, a Christmas that would be for Palestinians observed under rubble, in ruins, and in perpetual fear. And the Reverend Isaac Munther put this into words when he said, "If Jesus were born today, he would be born under the rubble in Gaza." And we all know that places of worship should be protected under the Geneva Conventions. And I say should be, because in this instance and many other instances they're not. And it's heartbreaking then to consider that both Nahida and Samar must have thought that they were safe in church, when in fact a sniper was targeting them. I can't imagine what the family were going through. Chair, what happened at the Holy Family Church is, I think, a microcosm of the war itself. A war where human rights are ignored, where long-standing conventions are breached, and where innocent people like Nahida and Samar are killed. And earlier this year, I asked the former Deputy Foreign Secretary whether the FCDO condemned the attack. The Right Honourable Gentleman said, and I quote, "We are not clear about the full facts of what happened." In contrast, Cardinal Vincent, the Archbishop of Westminster, was unambiguous. He said, "They were shot in cold blood inside the premises of the parish where there are no belligerents." The Cardinal also said, "The people of Gaza are not given to telling lies." Chair, I implore the Minister, from the bottom of my heart, to listen to the Palestinians in Gaza, reflect on the bitter injustices of Nahida and Samar's deaths, and to all of those who have suffered similar fates. Ms Vaz, the last time I spoke about Palestine and Westminster Hall, the death toll was 25,000. It's now, as we've heard, well over 41,000. So I urge the Minister to use the full weight of the FCDO to bring this war to an end, and to commit to the Palestinian people that we will assist them in rebuilding their lives. We need diplomacy, not an all-out war, and the people of Gaza cannot have another Christmas under the rubble.
Dr. Adam.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank my honourable member for securing this very vital discussion, and it's an honour to serve under your speak under your chairship. I just want to reiterate and confirm with my honourable member who discussed about the children. All victims of war are devastating, but when it comes to innocent children belonging to all faith and no faiths, it really does affect our humanity and our future. And I want to ask the Minister that as we speak, there are less than 16 hospitals standing in Gaza. And there is nowhere for children to be treated. And there are over 50,000 children that require treating who are not even victims of the war. It's malnutrition and other ailments that they are suffering from. Can we, like some of our other European partners, look at avenues and mechanisms to bring them here or treat them somewhere neutral to give them that much needed support that they need? Thank you very much.
Maskell.
And I congratulate the member for Pobal for organising today's event. The tragedy of Gaza just leaves us speechless. The devastation that we are witnessing is horrific on our screens, but to be in Gaza is unimaginable at this time. And of course, we stand by all those on both sides who are experiencing the trauma of loss with hostage taking and life lost. But we know that this can be prevented. It's immoral and it's man-made, and we've got to act stronger on this. Of course, we've got to end the sale of all arms and end those export licences. We need to up our funding, as the ambassadors called for, to UNRWA, and we need to apply greater leverage, including sanctions, to ensure that we can get a political outcome to this. But I have to question what happened on the 18th of September at the UN General Assembly, a forum where we could have used our influence in a different way. 124 countries, including our allies in France and Spain, Norway and New Zealand, had the courage to call for that ceasefire and to put it on record. And it's one thing to call, but when we have a vote, we know it is decisive and it makes a difference. And I just cannot comprehend why we didn't use our leverage at that critical point to try and stand by the people who are suffering in Gaza right now. Because we know that things are turning even worse, the suffering even greater. When we think about the seasonal change we're about to enter into and the risks that come from that, when we see the data from the Famine Early Warning System network highlighting the scale of malnutrition, hunger, and of course the spread of disease, when we know that people are dying every day before our eyes and we could do more, I just ask the Minister that when he is at those platforms and his colleagues, that he does everything possible within his power to use that leverage to call this to an end. We just cannot cross by on the other side, and we cannot seek to make perfection the enemy of good. And even if resolutions aren't perfect, we know that they can save lives, they can end the carnage, and they can build the hope of having food and clean water and aid to heal wounds and bring pain relief. So I just say to the Minister, every opportunity must be utilised to ensure that we have the humanitarian response to end this nightmare.
Sana Begum.
Thank you, Chair. In February this year, I secured and led a debate on the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. During the debate, I quoted Save the Children International's Chief Executive Officer's harrowing plea, "We are running out of words to describe the horror unfolding for Gaza's children." 8 months later, it is devastating, absolutely, utterly devastating to be here again today and that things have gone from worse to worse. As such, I urge the government today to refrain from the insult of the usual euphemistic phrasing of speaking of too many civilians being killed or broad references to the humanitarian situation without condemning the actions that are so clearly responsible. This is not about some random natural disaster. It is just beyond disturbing that so many cannot express a simple condemnation of the type of war being conducted by the Israeli military, the unprecedented death toll, the violence against women and children, the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, the blocking of aid and the weaponized starvation. It's just not enough to repeat the lines that Israel must uphold international human rights standards in theory when it is so clear that they have not and are not doing so and have effectively been given the go-ahead to continue to not do so. And quite frankly, the UK's continued support and facilitation of this is absolutely shocking to my constituents and indeed the majority of people in the UK. No matter the brutality and censorship at home, the silencing, the spin, and the inescapable truth is that civilians in Gaza, including large numbers of children, are facing healthcare shortages and diseases. This is what happens when hospitals are targeted and health and sanitation and other infrastructure are willfully destroyed. My constituents have opposed this, but this is what the UK continues to facilitate. Civilians in Gaza, including large numbers of children, are not only starving, but they are being starved. This is what happens when food is being prevented from getting to those who need it. Civilians in Gaza, including large numbers of children, are not simply dying, they are being killed. The lifting of the pause on funding to UNRWA is a welcome step forward, but as we speak, new mass displacement orders will worsen the entire already dire situation. I'm speculating today that the Minister will likely assert something along the lines that aid must get to where it is needed in theory. Yet everyone is clear that aid is being blocked and hindered by Israel, the UK's close and staunch ally. The best way we know to ensure that aid is delivered is to secure a ceasefire. I do want to mention that it's important that there is an arms embargo, including the F-35 fighter jets, which are being traded to be used against civilians. It does have implications for global human rights benchmarks. The horrors that are continuing to unfold before our eyes means that we are being changed forever. But it has been made very clear that UK and US foreign policy interests are being pursued with an utter disregard for Palestinian life. It is chilling, and the complicity will never, ever be forgotten.
Harry Gardner.
Thank you. As politicians, we talk of the international rules-based system, by which we mean the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, but often we only do so when it suits our position, and when it does not, we ignore it. That's why I believe it's crucial that we grasp the legal implications of the decision promulgated on the 19th of July this year by the International Court of Justice. It settled the law in its advisory opinion on the legality of Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. This opinion came from a request by the United Nations General Assembly in December 2022. I believe the opinion carries immense weight. It is the interpretation of our world's highest court of law as it relates to the occupation of Palestine. The court ruled that the occupied Palestinian territory is to be considered a single territorial unit. This means that the failure to recognize Palestine as a state is now out of step with international law. On September the 10th, Palestine took its seat at the 79th session of the General Assembly of the United Nations. It's not yet a full member because that has been blocked by the United States, but it has the right to submit proposals and amendments. The government of the UK still does not recognize the Palestinian state. I believe that is now incompatible with international law. The court ruled that settlements and outposts in the West Bank and East Jerusalem were unlawful. It doesn't matter that Israeli law considers settlements to be lawful. They are not, and they should be evacuated. The court ruled that Israel's exploitation of natural resources in settled land was also unlawful. The court ruled that Israel occupied Gaza. It ruled that it occupied the West Bank and East Jerusalem. It ruled that this occupation was unlawful. It ruled the occupation must be brought to an end. This also means that in its actions, Israel has to behave not as a warring nation state against another warring state, but as an occupying force with all the obligations that entails about its conduct, including ensuring that aid can get through to all who need it. Israel ought to cease its unlawful activities, halt all new settlement activity, and provide full reparation for the damage caused by its wrongful acts. This includes returning land, property, and assets seized since the occupation began in 1967 and allowing displaced Palestinians to return to their original places of residence. The court made it clear that other states also have obligations. It emphasized that all states are required not to recognize the illegal situation created by Israel's actions in the occupied territories. This means they should not engage in trade, investment, or diplomatic relations that would entrench Israel's unlawful presence. This advisory opinion is a landmark in the legal and political struggle over the fate of the Palestinian people and the integrity of international law. It highlights the obligations of all states, including the United Kingdom, to ensure that the rule of law prevails. We are all duty-bound to act, not only in the interests of justice and human rights, but to uphold the very principles of international law. That is the law. It's clear. It has been authoritatively stated by the court. What is not clear is whether governments will abide by it. The law can state, the court can rule, but none of it brings about anything unless the power of enforcement lies behind it. In the UK, we're very fond of saying that we respect the international court and the international rules-based order. My challenge to the Minister is this: show it.
I repeat again the absurdity of the situation where we give aid with the one hand to the besieged population of Gaza and where we provide weapons with the other, in which which have created the catastrophic circumstances which have taken the lives of at least over 40,000. Although the Prime Minister has made his position on the refusal to stop all arms sales to Israel abundantly clear in Parliament just this week, I nonetheless press on the matter. Would the Minister assure us, in light of especially further news today of a school housing displaced civilians in Gaza being bombed, and just weeks ago, a humanitarian safe zone, Al-Mawasi, a camp which had been identified by Israel itself, had been bombed, where families dissipated within a few seconds. I therefore ask the Minister once again, can he explain whether the government's position on arms sales to Israel will be revisited? And indeed, can the Minister answer whether or not, given the abundance in evidence already available, whether arms sales to a country accused of committing a plausible genocide can either be morally or legally justified?
Thank you. Very good. This afternoon, I congratulate the member for Birmingham Perry Bar for securing this debate. Before the recent recess, I tabled a written question to the government, an answer to which is overdue, so I'll briefly provide the background and put it to the Minister. On the 2nd of September, the government revoked licences for all items used in the current conflict in Gaza which go to the IDF. It did so because there exists a clear risk that they might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law. This is evidenced by events such as the IDF confirmed use of 2,000-pound bombs, bunker-busting bombs, in a declared safe zone in Al-Mawasi in July, when they killed at least 90 Palestinians and injured over 30. This revocation includes licences for F-35 fighter jet components, where they go directly to Israel, are revoked, but those in the supply chain in the global pool are not. But clearly, these components can still be used to facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law and frustrate humanitarian aid. So I ask my government to make it their policy to seek to negotiate an end-use agreement with F-35 programme supply chain and electronic stockpile management system counterparts to end the re-export of F-35s to Israel. The Dutch government has suspended direct sales but continues to supply the global pool. But surely a discussion must be had with partner nations on managing the programme so that the global pool of spare parts is not used to repair Israeli F-35 jets. Unless this issue is raised and resolved with partner nations, I submit that the government is at risk of breaching our own commitments to upholding humanitarian law, international humanitarian law. And I pray in aid the UN inquiry, which said on Thursday that it found that Israel carried out a concerted policy of destroying Gaza's healthcare systems in the Gaza war, actions amounting to both war crimes and the crime against humanity of extermination. So I urge my government to utilise all the levers at its disposal and accept that the recognition of the state of Palestine is a prerequisite of peace, and the optimal time to do so is now.
Yeah. Thank you, Ms. Barr. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and thank you to the Honourable Member for Perry Barr for securing this important debate. It's impossible to do justice to the horrors in Gaza in the short time today, famine conditions and polio amongst them. I was in Gaza in April this year, which was 6 months into the horrific humanitarian catastrophe that continues now. What I witnessed then was haunting, and it is so much worse in Gaza today. There are two main issues I wish to raise in today's debate. Firstly, there are alarming reports in the Israeli media that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is considering a proposal from Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, the far-right members of his cabinet, which would effectively prevent aid agencies, including the UN, from operating or distributing aid in Gaza, and would instead hand all responsibility for this to the Israeli military. This reportedly includes the running of field hospitals. There are many reasons why this would be unacceptable. In January this year, the International Court of Justice ordered immediate and effective measures to protect Palestinians in Gaza from the risk of genocide by ensuring sufficient humanitarian assistance and enabling access to basic services. Despite this, the number of aid trucks that entered Gaza last month was the lowest we have seen since the start of this year. This is not an accident. The aid is deliberately obstructed by the Israeli government. I saw in April the queues of hundreds of trucks filled with aid stuck at crossings into Gaza. The aid is there. It is simply not allowed to enter Gaza in the quantities needed, nor are aid workers allowed to safely distribute it. The fact that more than 300 aid workers and almost 1,000 healthcare workers have been killed in the last year is testament to this. When I left Gaza, I also visited warehouses full of aid items rejected by the Israeli authorities. I checked the list this morning preparing for this debate. It included crutches, wooden and metal, wheelchairs, green sleeping bags, commodes, solar lamps, first aid kits, an anaesthesia machine, generators, a bag of UNICEF footballs, bleach, pots and pans. I could go on. The idea that a government and a military which does this should be allowed to take operational control of a humanitarian aid effort is unconscionable. And I ask the Minister to be clear today that our government opposes this, and indeed to raise this with the Israelis. There is no excuse for the Israeli government's denial of Palestinians' access to humanitarian aid. It is a violation of international law. Secondly, the situation for civilians across Gaza is indeed a living nightmare. Worst of all is the situation for civilians in the north who've been trapped for over a year now. Months ago, civilians there were eating grass and animal feed to try to survive. It is so much worse now. I want to raise alarm today at the Israeli military's most recent forced displacement orders for civilians in the north of Gaza being told to move south. This includes orders to evacuate critically ill patients and healthcare workers from Al-Auda, the Indonesian and Kamal Adwan hospitals. This morning I've seen footage of intubated children in paediatric ICU in Kamal Adwan Hospital and babies in incubators. They cannot evacuate, and even if they could, there's nowhere safe to go. Does the Minister agree with me that this military action is intolerable, unacceptable and must end? Our new government has taken important first steps on UNRWA, arms and the ICC. There is much more to do. And finally, it is true, of course, that the Palestinians of Gaza need a ceasefire, access to aid, and the aid workers need to be able to work safely. But Palestinians don't just need aid. They have the same rights to safety, freedom and dignity as everyone else. And we in this House would do well to remember that.
Thank you, Ms Vaz. It's always a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and thank you to the member for Birmingham Perry Barr for securing this debate. The situation in Gaza is horrific and tragic. The British Red Cross have stated that more than 41,000 people have been killed in Gaza and many more injured and displaced. Hostages are still being held and survivors are traumatised. Meetings that I've attended with ambassadors for the region have searingly impressed upon me how desperate and urgent the situation now is in Gaza and the West Bank. Making sure that enough aid enters and is properly distributed to the people in Gaza is a moral imperative. It is also a legal imperative. In January, the International Court of Justice ordered Israel to take measures to prevent genocide, to ensure that humanitarian aid reaches Palestinians. And the order is not yet being complied with. As my honourable friends have said, aid is still being blocked. And on that, it is of particular concern that the Israeli military are forcing hospitals to shut down. These are full of displaced civilians, medical staff and sick patients, all of whom are protected under international law. The health system in Gaza must not be allowed to collapse. So my question to the Minister, and I thank him for all the work that he's doing on this issue, is whether he will confirm that the UK is taking urgent action to stop Israel from forcibly displacing Palestinians from the north, ensure adequate aid reaches those who need it, and ensure that civilians, including those in hospitals and in their homes, are protected at all times, and ultimately secure an urgent ceasefire. Respect for the international rule of law requires this.
Matthew. Steve Witherden.
It's a pleasure to speak under your chairpersonship, Ms Faz. I'd like to congratulate the honourable member for Birmingham Perry Bar on securing this crucial debate, which coincides with today's nationwide Workplace Day of Action for Palestine. This past year has been marked by indiscriminate loss, with lives tragically taken on October the 7th and in the ongoing horrors that we have witnessed unfold since. Over 41,000 people have been reported killed in Gaza, alongside 695 in the West Bank, with many more unaccounted for beneath the rubble. The impact on women and children has been particularly severe, with Oxfam reporting last week that more women and children have been killed in Gaza by the Israeli military this past year than in any other conflict over the last 2 decades. In addition to the ongoing daily bombardment, malnutrition, disease, and unmet medical needs pose an even greater threat to Palestinian lives. Yesterday marked a year since Israel's Minister of Defence declared a complete siege on Gaza, stating no electricity, no food, no water, no gas. It's all closed. The humanitarian crisis that has followed has been beyond comprehension. Approximately 83% of required food aid is blocked from entering Gaza, while the risk of famine becomes more imminent. Over 70% of civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, has been destroyed, with over 500 recorded attacks on medical facilities and hundreds of healthcare workers killed. And last month, the United Nations reported that the number of aid workers killed in Gaza this past year is the highest ever recorded in a single crisis. While food aid and healthcare under attack, and aid workers paying the ultimate price for their efforts to provide relief, we must urgently address this humanitarian disaster and ensure unimpeded aid reaches all those who so desperately need it. I welcome the actions taken by the Labour government to facilitate the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza in our first months in office. We have restored funding to UNRWA and engaged with the United Nations Security Council to ensure a global focus on protecting civilians in Gaza. However, given the scale of the crisis, our government should be doing everything in its power to secure an immediate and permanent ceasefire. Without it, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza will worsen, obstructing essential aid and prolonging suffering. The decision in September to suspend around 30 UK arms export licences to Israel from a total of approximately 350 marks a crucial step towards achieving a ceasefire for all Palestinians and Israelis. However, by excluding export licences for F-35 fighter jet parts from this announcement, the UK risks complicity in Israel's potential violations of international law. These jets, described as the most lethal fighter jet in the world, are partly manufactured in Britain and are currently deployed in Gaza, causing significant civilian casualties and hindering the distribution of aid while destroying vital healthcare infrastructure. Can the Minister clarify how the decision to continue allowing licences for F-35 components exported via third-party countries aligns with the UK's international legal obligations? Additionally, How does this approach ensure that critical aid can be delivered securely to alleviate the suffering in Gaza, especially given the current risks to medical workers and the destruction of healthcare facilities? We must urgently end these atrocities and stand for humanity, as allowing the horrifying decline of this conflict to continue will lead to even greater consequences. Diolch yn fawr.
Tahir Ali.
Under your chairmanship. The people of Gaza are being let down by the international community. We have reached a point where the human suffering and total devastation in the area is undeniable. Yet we continue to fail to provide a sustainable amount of life-saving aid. The Palestinian people should not be subjected to lack of food, water and medical supplies. I have received hundreds of emails from my constituents of Birmingham, Hall Green and Moseley, who are extremely worried about the restrictions to food and humanitarian aid due to the new customs rule on aid trucks enforced by the Israeli government. The United Nations reports that in September, over 90% of efforts to get trucks into Gaza were either denied or delayed by the Israeli government. Palestinian children are suffering the most from the catastrophic restrictions being imposed on them. Over 2 million people, more than 90% of the population in Gaza, are living in tents and are being forced from their homes by the Israeli government's action. This will prove to be a deadly winter, and as we approach winter with the danger of hypothermia, Israel's ongoing attack punishes the Palestinian people by denying them human rights to adequate housing. It is now time for action. We have heard words in this House for over 12 months, and it's about time them words translated into action. Israel must be held accountable for the war crimes they are committing, and the government must now stop all arms sales to Israel. The international community needs to work together and look into viable ways in which we can directly get vital aid into Gaza. Finally, we need to push for a full and permanent ceasefire to stop this humanitarian disaster and give international organisations proper access to Gaza. And I thank the member for bringing and securing this debate today.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. It does not need saying, because anyone with eyes to see can see it, but we cannot say it often enough, that too many civilians have died over the last year in the Middle East. It is so important that as few as possible follow them. Before being elected, I worked at Save the Children, and I've worked on migration policy for the last 15 years. And I'm profoundly worried by the high levels of displacement that we're seeing in the Middle East. 1 million people have been displaced in Lebanon. Within Gaza, it's estimated that 9 in 10 people have been displaced at some point. This is awful for those personally affected, but it is also profoundly politically destabilising to an already febrile situation. This adds to the potential for escalation and therefore miscalculation. We should be terrified of escalation and miscalculation. That is the biggest threat to the humanitarian situation, because we have already seen things escalate appallingly quickly. We must be clear. Escalate to de-escalate is a falsehood, it is misguided, and it will strategically misfire for all. Will the government strain every sinew to avoid further escalation in the Middle East? The reason is not just political or diplomatic, it is humanitarian. Too many have died already, and the only way to stop more joining them is by stopping escalation. I know the Minister will be constrained in what he can say today, and I welcome the decisions on UNRWA, on arms and the ICC, and on the commitment to the rule of law. But can he reassure us that the government's aim in this situation is de-escalation for humanitarian ends? Thank you.
We're going to try and get everyone in. We've got 3 people. You've wind up at 5 past, so if you can keep it short. Lawrence Turner.
Thank you, Ms. Faz. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and may I also thank the Honourable Member for Birmingham Perry Bar on securing this important and timely debate. Earlier this week, the House marked the 1-year anniversary of the October 7th atrocities, and on that day, in the days that followed, Hamas and other groups intended to ignite a wider war and the death and destruction that would follow in its wake. Today, when more than 2 million people have been displaced and more than 40,000 Palestinians are dead, and the threat of wider war looms all too closely, we must redouble our efforts in pursuit of an immediate ceasefire, the return of hostages, and real progress after these long years towards a two-state solution that upholds the dignity of the Palestinian people and the security and territorial integrity of both nations. 6 months ago, the Israeli Defence Minister said that we plan to flood Gaza with aid and we are expecting to reach 500 trucks per day. But since then, the World Health Organization has warned that life-saving hospital aid, as members have said, is cut off, and the UN has warned that starvation has spread throughout Gaza. There were just 52 aid trucks each day in September, a bare tenth of pre-October rates, and far short of the total needed to relieve that extreme distress. So noting that it's the UK government's existing assessment that Israel is not ensuring life-saving food and medical supplies reach civilians in Gaza, will the Minister update us today on what representations and protests the UK government has made to the Israeli government on the entry of food and aid into Gaza? What steps is the government taking to work with aid agencies and civil society to offer protection to aid workers who are, including British aid workers who face unacceptable risk? And will he give us a broader update on the UK government's efforts to progress ceasefire talks and bring forward a credible reconstruction programme in Gaza? I know that honourable members here welcome the decision to reinstate UNRWA funding. That cannot be the end of the process. I know that the Minister also takes this issue seriously, and I hope that he will ensure that there is further debate and a scrutiny on this important matter in this House.
So 2 minutes left. Blair McDougall.
Oh, automatic. Apologies. I began this week speaking commemorating the hostages who were taken on October the 7th. I see no contradiction in ending by recognising the horror of the humanitarian situation within Gaza. And I think it's important to put on record that people in Gaza do not choose to be ruled by Hamas. There was a poll published last month which showed that 2/3 of people in Gaza support a two-state solution, not the destruction of Israel, and only 6% support Hamas. But I wanted, in the short time I've got, to ask the Minister to reflect on 3 particular things. First of all, in a deeply uncertain environment, we know one thing, which is that winter's coming. It's about to get colder, it's about to get wetter. And we know that with the lower immunity that people have due to malnutrition, particularly for children, that means an increased risk of respiratory diseases, of diarrhoea and other common diseases. And so along with others, I'd like to ask the Minister what more he can do to make sure that more shelter and more hygiene kits are allowed through and reach those who need it. Secondly, and looking beyond the ceasefire we all want to see happen, I want to talk about the long tail of food insecurity within Gaza. Dozens of bakeries have been destroyed. About 2/3 of agricultural land has been damaged in some way. The fields, the greenhouses, the polytunnels, the irrigation systems have been damaged. And the plan for the day after has to start now. So I wonder what plans the government has to ensure that horticulture, livestock farming, fishing are restored, that the bakeries are rebuilt and the markets are rebuilt, because otherwise this isn't going to be a short-term emergency but a long-term problem. And then finally on reconstruction, after the 2014 Gaza war, there were generous pledges made by international donors for reconstruction. In some cases, the funds pledged just simply didn't come through. In many cases, attempts to reconstruct were blocked by the Israeli government. And in other cases, for example, Fatah accused Hamas of stealing hundreds of millions of dollars of reconstruction aid as well. In 2014, about 150,000 properties were damaged in some way. In this war, it's far, far outstripped that. And so I wonder what he can do, working with international partners, to make sure that the failures after the last 2014 war in Gaza are not repeated.
Thank you. To get the last speaker in, Brian Matthew.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Chair. I speak as someone who knows, or rather knew, Gaza in the happy times, when as a young university researcher I went with my Israeli friends from Kibbutz Re'im to meet their Arab friends in Gaza City, to drink coffee and to trade. We've heard in this debate of the horror and the passion. We've heard also of solutions, of a recognition of the state of Palestine, and indeed the inclusion of the evacuation of wounded children. War is a horrible thing, and it makes people behave badly, especially when they feel and indeed have been hurt, as the Israelis have been by the events of October the 7th last year. There are things that can be done that we've heard today, including the release of the hostages and the end of the war, but there are also things that must be done in the future to see Palestine's future assured. Things like the closure of the illegal settlements in the West Bank, indeed like the rebuilding of Gaza itself. For this to happen, trust needs to be built. And for this to be built, our government needs to be talking not just to the leadership, but also the opposition in Israel. Jaw is indeed better than war. Thank you.
The Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Monica Hardy.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I want to congratulate the Honourable Member for Birmingham Perry-Barr for securing the debate on this most critical issue. This is my first contribution in my capacity as Liberal Democrat spokesperson for international development, and this is a hugely pressing issue. To begin, honourable members have spoken of the many aid agencies working in incredibly difficult situations and risking their lives. I want to add my voice in paying tribute to them. Liberal Democrats share the calls we have heard today for an immediate recognition of a Palestinian state, and we urge the government to use every lever it has to de-escalate the conflict. Conflict is escalating in the Middle East. We are on the brink of a regional war, which would be of devastating consequence to the innocent civilians, be they Palestinian, Lebanese, Israeli or Iranian. We now face a second humanitarian crisis in the region in Lebanon, where hundreds of thousands are already displaced, in addition to the many Syrian refugees already living in Lebanon. We cannot afford for Lebanon to become a failed state. We welcome the increase in aid to Lebanon of £10 million, but frankly, this is a drop in the ocean. As recently as 2019 to 20, the UK ODA allocation to Lebanon was over 200 million. This year, we are looking at less than 20 million. And amidst the tensions in the region, we cannot and we must not forget Gaza. Liberal Democrats continue to call for an immediate bilateral ceasefire in Gaza, to resolve the humanitarian devastation there, to get the hostages out and open the door to a two-state solution. Clearly, there is a dire humanitarian need in the Strip. Amidst an escalation of the conflict in the region, the flow of essential goods into Gaza has been critically restricted, causing a drop in aid supplies and a critical shortage of commercial goods. Aid entering Gaza has plummeted to its lowest level in months. If the flow of assistance does not resume, over 1 million vulnerable people will lose the assistance they rely on in October. 3/4 of Gaza's population relies on food aid to survive. People have run out of ways to cope, food systems have collapsed, and the risk of famine persists. The World Health Organization is now looking to carry out the second phase of a polio inoculation campaign after the first case of polio in Gaza in 25 years was found over the summer. we are calling on the UK government to increase humanitarian support to Gaza. Liberal Democrats have long urged the government to restore the 0.7% of national income target for international development spending. Indeed, when in government, we enshrined that target in law. Now that the aid budget has been so depleted, we are facing humanitarian crises like these with one hand tied behind our back. So we continue to urge the government to look again at returning to 0.7%. There are also specific problems with getting aid into Gaza. There is not enough humanitarian aid getting into the Strip, and the Rafah crossing is shut. I hope the Government Minister will provide an update on what exchanges he and his counterparts have been having with all relevant agencies, and in particular with the Israeli government, to ensure that aid is stepped up. Second, we know that there are particular problems with the distribution of aid within Gaza, with no deconfliction system in place. We have heard about how aid entering into one part of the Strip does not get to its intended destination because human need is so great along the way. Will the Minister update us on what work the FCDO is doing to try and make it easier and safer for aid to be distributed in a manner which protects the safety of aid workers? Third, we are now moving into the winter months, and as the temperatures drop, this poses particular challenges for the humanitarian situation within the Strip. It is vital that we are acting now and quickly with our allies, doing all we can to ensure that we can support Gazans through these winter months and beyond. Will the Minister update us to what steps he and ministerial colleagues are taking to this end? Fourth, on UNRWA, Liberal Democrats welcome the government's decision to once again provide UK ODA to UNRWA. Can the Minister update us on what conversations he has had with counterparts in UNRWA, including about the implementations of the Kelowna report? It is vital that these recommendations are implemented as soon as possible, thereby assuring that all work to support Palestinians in Gaza is of the highest possible standards and integrity. Finally, looking across from Gaza into the West Bank, would the Minister be able to update us about the level of UK ODA being provided to support the Palestinian Authority? Clearly, supporting the Palestinian Authority and improving wider conditions for Palestinians is absolutely vital at this difficult moment.
Opposition spokesperson Dame Harriet Baldwin. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Ms Vaz, and it's been an opportunity to hear voices this afternoon from across the United Kingdom. I'd like to congratulate the member for Birmingham Perry Barr on securing the debate, but we've heard voices not only from Birmingham but from London, across the English home counties. We've heard strong Scottish voices, we've heard from Durham, York. In the interest of time, I won't list every constituency where we heard passionately and expressively that the Palestinians are facing a devastating humanitarian crisis. And I believe the UK should continue to play a leading role in alleviating that suffering. This week of all the weeks, though, we must remind ourselves that on October 7th, Israel suffered an appalling attack, a modern-day pogrom, the worst loss of Jewish lives since the Second World War, a horrific display of anti-Semitism and a brutal reminder of the existential threats that Israel has to contend with. And we must all restate that Israel has the right to defend itself in accordance with international humanitarian law. But as we've heard, so many innocent civilians are suffering, not only in Israel, but in Gaza and now in Lebanon. And this conflict must come to a sustainable end as quickly as possible, starting with the immediate, unconditional release of the remaining hostages captive in Gaza, including the British citizen, Emily Damari. Can I ask the Minister, a former hostage negotiator himself, for an update on the government's efforts to secure her release and those of the other hostages who are in such awful jeopardy? The previous UK government trebled our aid commitment in the last financial year and facilitated aid flows into Gaza by land, by sea, by air. In the interest of time, I won't list them all, but we will just focus on the airdrops, the 11 airdrops delivered directly to Gaza through a temporary pier marine corridor that was supported by the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, and the funding of field hospitals treating thousands of patients. Can the Minister confirm that these efforts continue under the new government? During the previous government, Israel committed to increasing the amount of aid getting into Gaza, including by allowing the delivery of humanitarian aid through Ashdod and Erez, extending the opening hours of Kerem Shalom, increasing the total number of aid trucks to at least 500 a day, and allowing more types of aid, including fuel for bakeries and hospitals. And we welcome the recent pause for polio vaccinations and wish to put on record the gratitude to the World Health Organization, the British Red Cross, the World Food Programme and UNICEF staff who are doing such vital humanitarian work and who should be commended because, as we've heard today, aid workers are not a target. Protecting humanitarian actors must be a priority, and guaranteed deconfliction for aid convoys and other humanitarian work is essential. We should also take this opportunity to pay tribute to all of the brave aid workers who work in Gaza and our fellow citizens, James Kirby, John Chapman and James Henderson, who were killed delivering aid in Gaza earlier this year. Can we have an update from the Minister on the work that the government is doing to advance on these key areas? What steps has it taken to help increase the amount of aid getting over the border into Gaza? What additional aid supplies and humanitarian support has the UK sent? What action has the government taken to make the case for the protection of humanitarian personnel on the ground distributing that aid? I will skip, in the interest of time, over the situation with UNRWA, but I would like to hear an update from the Minister on the implementation of the Colonna recommendations and the UK government's scrutiny of that. And as we heard earlier this week from the leader of the opposition, the situation in the Middle East is grave. There is no equivalence between Iran's terrorist proxies and Israel. Israel has a right to defend itself. We support Israel in these goals, but too many innocent civilian lives have been lost and irreparably changed by this conflict. The UK should continue to carefully support them through our humanitarian aid commitments, and I look forward to the Minister reporting progress to us today. Minister Hamish Faulkner.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for Perry Barr for securing the important debate, and could I thank the Chair for your expert management of today's proceedings. This is my first debate in this place, so I'm sure I'll be considerably less expert, so I'll beg your indulgence at the outset. I'll try and be brief so that I can give an opportunity to the member to respond. This week, as many have said, we've marked the 1 year since Hamas's brutal attack against Israel. It was the worst attack in their history, and without doubt, the darkest day in Jewish history since the Holocaust. As many have said in this chamber, my thoughts are with the Jewish people around the world and the Jewish community here in the United Kingdom. Over 1,000 people were massacred, hundreds were taken hostage, including Emily Damari, and many are still cruelly detained today, including Emily Damari. And I want to reiterate our commitment to bring those hostages home. We won't give up until they are, and work is ongoing on that. But we also, as has been the subject of most of the interventions, look back on a year of devastating conflict and suffering. I will say a little bit about the government's assessment of the situation in Gaza, and then I will try and focus in the time that I have, particularly on the humanitarian situation. I recognise particularly that it is my fault that there are some late parliamentary questions back and on these issues, particularly in relation to the detail on F-35s. I'll be pleased to come back in writing. So a year on, close to 42,000 people have now been killed in Gaza, with over half of all bodies identified being women and children. We believe more than 90% of the population have been displaced, many of them repeatedly. There is now simply no safe place to go. The humanitarian zone covers less than 15% of the Gaza Strip, and as one of the contributors mentioned, not even that is always safe. It's chronically overcrowded, and the lack of clean water and sanitation means the risk of disease is rife. There's been reference, too, to the severe lack of food, which, according to the IPC, means that the whole population is at risk of starvation, and we expect a further update on that in due course. 66% of buildings, including hospitals, as many have mentioned, are damaged or destroyed. Parents cannot feed their children. Children cannot go to school. Families cannot support each other. I've been asked many questions by contributors about humanitarian access, and I want to be clear on the position of the government. It remains wholly inadequate. There have been repeated attacks on convoys, evacuation orders have undermined operations, and aid is far below Israel's commitment to flood Gaza with aid.
Would the Minister give way? I think I've got to the Minister. I raised earlier the Israeli military action that he's just referred to. In the past hour or so, the UN has stated on its website that IDF fired on UN peacekeepers in Lebanon early Thursday morning. 2 peacekeepers were injured. Yet further evidence that Israel has behaved with complete contempt and disregard for international law and norms. Will he join me in condemning such action?
Minister.
Thank you. So, as these reports have only just come in, but we are very concerned about reports of attack on UNIFIL staff, and we'll be able to say more as the reports become clearer. But the work of UN peacekeepers is incredibly important and a vital contribution to global peace and security. We'll be able to say more as reports become clearer. The situation in Gaza is a catastrophe on all counts. A few contributors have mentioned winterization. We are deeply, deeply concerned that winter is coming in, and the shortage of aid into Gaza means that most of the civilian population is unprepared for the drop in temperature. I'll be visiting the region next week, in part to look into some of these matters further. We intend to work together with our allies. Since entering office in July, we have taken a series of key decisions. Along with our allies, we have been pushing for an immediate ceasefire since day one. And I was confused by the reference to our position on, I think, the 18th of September. We have been calling for an immediate ceasefire since the 4th of July. We will continue to call for an immediate ceasefire. The fact that it has not yet been abided by does not in any way undermine the urgency of what we are doing.
Bridget Maskell.
The UN General Assembly resolution that was where we didn't vote with 124 countries.
Minister.
I think that's an issue in relation to the advisory opinion of the ICJ rather than the ceasefire, which is how I'd understood your remarks. So I'm just sticking just to ceasefire now, and I can come to the advisory opinion later. We are clear we need a ceasefire. We need a ceasefire in Gaza, and we need a ceasefire in Lebanon. It is clearly a statement of fact that neither of those things are happening, and we continue to work behind the scenes with our partners to try to achieve that. That point has been made both by the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, and the whole ministerial team in the Foreign Office. We are repeatedly urging our Israeli counterparts, because it is on that question that I think I've received most questions over the course of this afternoon. We are asking them to take 3 key steps. First, all necessary precaution to avoid civilian casualties, and we've had many lurid examples of where that has not been the case. Secondly, to ensure aid can flow freely into Gaza through all land routes. Many contributors have described how that is not currently the case. And thirdly, to allow the UN and its humanitarian partners to operate safely and effectively. And I recognise some of the concerns that have been raised this afternoon about the functioning of UNRWA. So let me say a little bit about that.
Barry Gardner.
Very grateful to him and congratulate him on making his maiden address in that case. Can I just ask him to reflect then on the verb that he used? He said, we've been asking Israel to do these 3 things. He then went on to adumbrate that none of those 3 had actually been fulfilled. Isn't it time to stop asking and to do something a little stronger?
Minister.
So my colleague will understand that there is a difference between what you can say in public and what you can say in private. But what I would reassure him that these points are being made with force, with emphasis, with consistency, with partners that we have, as he will have seen through a number of forums over the last few weeks. The UK has made its position absolutely clear. It is, of course, a frustration to me that we are still, at this stage, since we came into power in July, that we're still having some of these discussions. So I recognise the frustration in his voice as well. Returning briefly to UNRWA. On my first day as a minister, we lifted the funding pause on UNRWA. We provided £21 million to support their humanitarian appeal in Gaza. No other agency can deliver aid to Gaza on the scale needed. We must support it to do its job effectively. Of course, in delivering, we expect UNRWA to meet the highest standards of neutrality. as laid out in Catherine Colonna's independent review, and the Minister for Development has met Catherine Colonna to discuss these matters. £1 million of our funding to UNRWA this year has gone to support the implementation of its agreed action plan. But I take note of the reference to some of the discussions in the Israeli Knesset. So I want to really emphasise the importance that the UK places in UNRWA, in its continued function, its unique role in the area, and our full support for the UN Secretary General as well.
John MacDonald.
I'm sorry to interrupt his flow, but before he sits down, could he just give me some assurance that he's going to take back to his colleagues the issues about the evacuation of children? Yeah. I raised it again on Monday with the Prime Minister and still got no response.
Yes, thank you. So I was coming to that issue, but let me take it now. So I'm very familiar with these issues. In fact, as an official in 2014, I was working with MAP, where I know my colleagues have also served, to try and identify, at that time, in that stage of the war, and it's incredibly depressing to 10 years on be in this chamber talking about injured children in Gaza again. But at that time, I was tasked to try and find children who could benefit from UK medical assistance, and honestly was not able to find children who would not be better served in the region. Having discussed with officials, and I understand the Minister for Development has looked at this as well, we are of the view primarily that the WHO guidance that children should be treated in the region as much as possible. That will mean in most cases that being treated in Egypt or somewhere nearby is going to be more appropriate than being treated in the UK. But I will go back to the department and ensure a follow answer. So I want to just return briefly to the mandate of the UN. We're clear that Israel must respect the mandate of the UN, and they must, too, enable humanitarian workers easily to travel into and throughout Gaza. Yeah.
Absana Begum.
That aid and aid workers are being hindered and blocked by Israel. The UK considers Israel at the same time to be one of its closest allies. How does that make sense in terms of how the UK is representing itself on the UN and on the world platform? And he seems to be suggesting on the one hand that efforts are being made to secure a ceasefire to provide aid when it's very obvious that there is a block and that the UK is facilitating that as opposed to opposing it.
Minister.
I don't accept that we are facilitating rather than opposing it. I could not be clearer in everything I've said this afternoon about the position of the British government. I've been clear with my colleagues, our frustration that we have not been able to make more progress on the things that we have been calling for. But I'd just like to reassure colleagues across the House that the whole ministerial team is working hard day and night on these issues, and we recognise the acute nature of the situation before us, and we treat it with the full gravity that it deserves. I'm just going to try and make a tiny bit more progress, if that's all right, and then I'll hand back.
Got a minute left, Minister.
Well, I'll probably get to the end then, in order to allow people to respond. So, from the Prime Minister down, we will continue to call on all parties to act in accordance with international humanitarian law. Earlier in July, when he was visiting the region, the Foreign Secretary announced £5.5 million in new medical aid to field hospitals in Gaza, which I think was the subject of a question from over there. We are working to try and bolster medical capacity for patients. We think that is best done in the region, and we are frustrated by the impediments that still exist, particularly around children being able to access medical care and other
Order.
aid.
I just want to get the question in.
Okay.
So, thank you very much, Minister. So thank all honourable members. Everyone got in who wanted to speak. So the motion is that this House has considered humanitarian aid and Gaza. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.